Do you know someone in foster care? Have you been in foster care? Do you have a child in foster care? Are you a grandparent or relative caring for a family member? Are you considering becoming a foster parent? Then tune in every Wednesday at 3 p.m. to Fresh Start Today on WNOV 860 AM to engage in thought-provoking conversations with families and providers about child welfare services, both locally and nationally. Together, we can save our children. Good afternoon. You're listening to Fresh Start Today. I'm your host, Jermaine Reed, and I have a special guest in the studio with me, Dr. Ramel Smith. And soon to be joining us on the phone will be Dr. Daisy Nelson Century, who does a lot of reenactment of historical figures like Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, Phyllis Wheatley, Bessie Coleman, among others. And so she's going to be joining us a little bit later. But today on the show, Dr. Smith, we're going to be talking about understanding the importance of a healthy racial, ethnic, and cultural identity for developing children. And so Dr. Nelson will be joining us and portraying the historic, iconic civil rights. Not civil rights, it was a Civil War. She was a spy, a nurse, and conductor on the Underground Railroad, the infamous Harriet Tubman. So she'll be joining us pretty soon.
The famous.
The famous, yes. So we're going to be talking about her life and what was going on during the time when she was a child and the different child welfare policy at that time, which was basically slavery. Children were looked at as property, adults and family, and how that impacted that society. And if there's any correlations or some similarities between foster care and slavery. Yes. So we're going to talk about those pieces in our discussion today. But how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Always great to be here with Fresh Start. You know how that is.
Oh, that's great. How important is a healthy identity, and not just identity, but racial and ethnic cultural identity for children?
I think it's paramount for success. Whenever you think about Imhotep, it's usually credited with Socrates. You know, the first rule was know thyself, but really it was Imhotep from Egypt, you know, our great first physician from that time era. And basically what that goes into, if you don't know yourself, there's no way you can get to know others. If you don't know yourself, there's no way you can love yourself. If you don't love yourself, you can't love others. So when we talk about a world in which we live in which race is such a big issue, such a big critical thing that's put on with the propaganda, the media, through the news, newspaper, television, where race is such a big issue, we take pride in it. And one of the ways in which our ancestors were broken down was to remove that sense of identity. So our names were taken. Our language was taken, our religion was taken. And when you look at all of those things, if you want to enslave a person, you remove them from who they are, because if you don't know who you are, we know our legacy coming from kings and queens, from pharaohs, and then you look at how we act sometimes today, so far from what we were, it's just really a matter of not knowing who we are. But when you know who you are, and you take pride in who you are, what you recognize is, hey, I'm something special. There's a legacy for me to continue to follow, and it leads up on that same pattern.
Now we know that February is identified as Black History Month, and I don't know if that is good or bad.
But you know, I think it was good, because when it was first started, it was started by a man named Carter G. Woodson. Okay. Carter G. Woodson had Negro Achievement Week, because at that time, we sometimes we don't like February because that's the only month sometimes where we get something. But back in that time when he started it, there was nothing. There was absolutely nothing. There was no Martin Luther King Day.
It's just the coldest month. That's nice.
And but what he wanted to do was for us to have that racial identity, that racial pride, to recognize this was a week to understand that we weren't just the ancestors of slaves, that we came from a proud people, and that there was something about our culture, our race, that we should take pride in. And not only take pride in, but to build and to increase that legacy, because it's such a powerful legacy. It was increased from a week to a month. However, what's happened now is, because once it became more mainstream, now it became a chance to water it down, for us to talk about the same 5 people where we get sick of hearing about it, where we get mad at white people because we just see all the oppression. And I think what we have to do, Malcolm X said it best. He said our history didn't start and change. And I think what we fail to do sometimes in America, especially during Black History Month, we always start with the Middle Passage. We always start with even when we look at when you look at the movie Roots, what I loved about it, before they showed Kunta Kinte being transported, they showed him in his home, in his village, full of love. They showed him what a rites of passage, that thing that boys had to know. This was the time I went from being a boy to a man. This is not what I owe to my tribe, to my village. And so when we think about Black History Month, I think we need to encapsulate our full culture. But as you see now, I think Tom Joyner is more famous for saying it said Black History Month 365 days a year. So it's up to us we can take a month to truly celebrate it, but I think it's up to us to make sure that we never forget it, those other 365s, and that we do celebrate it. Maybe with not the same pomp and intensity as in February, but still with the same glorious attitude that it deserves to be recognized.
And with that being said, I would like to dedicate today's show to the thousands upon thousands of African American children who are in the foster care system.
Modern day slavery system.
Many people refer to it as a modern day slave. I've heard that and I've read that, and part of me believe that because there's a lot of similarities between slavery and foster care. And we're going to really talk about that, the trauma of that, the disconnection in family, and violence that goes on, and drugs. So we'll talk about that when Dr. Nelson gets on. But these thousands of African American children in the system, when you start talking about oppression and you talk about stripping people of their culture, amazingly, from the research I've done, looking at the different child welfare bureaus and systems across the country, there's not one that really stands out, that really takes some extensive measures or protocol to honor the race, the culture, the heritage of those children who are placed in their custody. So that's one area I would like to really see maybe the state of Wisconsin take the lead on, is really looking at capitalizing on months like February to really do something, considering that you have a large percentage of the children, disproportionately speaking, African American children make up the majority of the children in our system. Locally, 68% of the Milwaukee Child Welfare's client base are African American children. So it would really be nice to see if we could really look at what we can do to get agencies and service providers who are being funded and paid to care for these children, and particularly nurture their well-being, to make sure that there is some element there that will celebrate who they are, because their history and their heritage begins before being detained or removed from their parents into the system.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point. Oftentimes, I think when we think about foster care, we think about somebody who is sheltered, who's fed and whatnot. But sometimes I don't know if we look at some of those other kind of intangible things that's needed. I think love is number one, and then a close two is as far as what you're saying, as far as racial, cultural identity, something for them to understand. Although I may be separated, what gives me a sense of belonging, of who I am? I mean, it's an age-old philosophical question. Who am I? Why am I here? What's this point? And I think sometimes when we have an understanding of our history, of our immediate family, of our ancestry, it gives us a greater ideal and a sense of purpose of what we're here to do.
Right. Well, this is going to be a great conversation. Again, we're going to be talking about understanding the importance of a healthy racial, ethnic, and cultural identity for developing children, and particularly children who are in out-of-home care. And our special guest today will be Dr. Daisy Nelson Century, and she does a lot of reenactment of historic female Black women, and so she'll be joining us on the line pretty soon. But I think in terms of this whole honoring our culture and our race, and making sure that children, regards to whether they're African American, Latino, but that we honor who they are, their entire person. And one way I think we can do that is that ensuring that when children are placed in homes with individuals outside of their race, outside of their communities, how are we providing some oversight there? I don't know if it's something that has to be incorporated into their treatment plan or whatever, just to ensure that they are being celebrated.
No. I laugh only because the other day I'm going through the TV, and on one of the channels on cable that's not a normal kind of sitcom channel, pops up the sitcom. What's with Willis and Arnold? Different strokes. Different strokes.
I was just thinking about Gary Cole yesterday.
And so no, it was a funny one because this specific episode, Mr. Drummond and was talking to the boys, and one of the things what he was saying, like we took them out of the ghetto,
Yeah.
and so he had his their friends to come and rejoin them, but they had been gone away for so long that there was a detachment. The friends had thought they had changed because they had some different, affluent status.
Right,
They believed
right.
that their friends changed because they weren't happy for them and whatnot. So I think the important lesson really that I take about that, and I add that part of pop society, pop culture, into a realistic life, is to say understanding when you do get individuals and you pull them from a certain society in which they were in, how important it is to keep them attached to that from the beginning. And it goes to your point of racial identity, and not just as far as bringing friends around, but also how you decorate the house. I just went to Barnes and Nobles yesterday and bought about 8 books, and they were the craziest thing. I never saw a kid's book on Malcolm X until yesterday.
Wow.
So I bought it. It was on Malcolm Little. But so to be able to read these to my kids, I think that's very important for them to, when they look around the house, to see black art, to see black people on the television screen, to see black people in a positive manner,
Right,
on a magazine cover and things of that nature. We all grew up, with the jet, with the ebony and the essence, and now Black Enterprise. You get to see people who look like you in a positive manner. And
What about Good Housekeeping? Magazine around?
We had but I mean, some people had it in their house. I think we was there just the opposite way. My parents were probably more on the real cultural identity, where we didn't even get a lot the other side, because you're so if you live in America, it's impossible not to get that side. So they wanted to make sure at home we had a secure base of who we are and a self-love.
Well, we're going to take a break and then continue this conversation about understanding the importance of a healthy racial, ethnic, and cultural identity for developing children. And so after this, we'll be right back. We're talking about understanding the importance of a healthy racial, ethnic, and cultural identity for developing children, with an emphasis and focus on children who are in out-of-home care. But there's some things that we'll talk about in this conversation that can be universally applied. So we were talking about the importance of racial identity and child welfare communities across the country really stepping up and doing things to honor and the culture of children who they're responsible for. And so I want to kind of talk about racial identity. And on our break, Dr. Smith, you were talking about William Cross's Nigressen's system. Was it a model, a system, a theory?
It's a racial identity development theory.
Okay.
And so basically, in any racial identity theory, what the thesis of it is understanding who I am, understanding that there's a struggle in trying to find out who you are, going through different phases, different spans of trying to really figure out who you are, and then eventually coming to some type of conclusion on who you are as a person, as a whole, after you've gone, maybe made some mistakes, tried different things. And so for example, like you'll see a young person who lives kind of like in a state of, hey, kumbaya, everybody's good, we're all equal, it's good. But then you start to get information through the media, through television, through newspaper, through hearing things, through seeing things. You travel through a neighborhood, you're on 5th and North Avenue, and you see how it look. But then you travel 100 blocks down, and now you're on 105th and North Avenue, and you say, hold on, this looks a little bit different.
Right.
Well, what's the thing? And so then you start to equate it, and we had talked about this before. It was done back in the late 60s, the dial theory, and basically the dial theory, you would have black kids looking at different dials, and they would judge the black dial to be bad and the white dial to be good. And so what happened is, specifically in this Nigressen's model, as an African American, as a black person, what we started to see was that white was right, that the dominant culture had different advantages. So as a kid, you say, hey, I want to be identified with that. So that's the whole thing. I want to be lighter. I want to look white. I want to act white. I want to do those things. But then what always happens, without fail, and this is for all of us, we can talk about this, there's always that experience that happens to let us know that we're black. It's when you're a young kid, you get pulled over by the police officer, say, man, they told me about this was going to happen, I didn't believe it, and you say, man, it's in my face like before. You're in the mall, you're in the store, and somebody starts following you around, and you say, wow, this is that. You have that click where you understand that you're black, but instead of being embarrassed to be black, now what you do is you take it to the extreme. Say, yeah, I'm proud to be black, and that's a fact, and I'm gonna do whatever I have to do, by any means necessary. And so sometimes we go all the way out to a militant existence where you don't want to have anything to do with a white person. You don't want to have anything to do outside of the black culture itself. And that's sometimes where you get our Pan-Africanist brothers and sisters who want to move and say, hey, we Marcus Garvey, we back to Africa. We don't want to have nothing to do with this culture of people who once enslaved our ancestors, will never give us equal rights and things of that nature. But even sometimes when you get inside of a movement like that, you'll see that there's some issues inside of that. And then what we come to realize is that, hey, let me do what Martin Luther King said. Let me judge people by the content of the character and not just by the color of their skin, and then we try to move along with that. And so we set up that foundation all along to say about this with young children. The more that a child is in foster care and they stay shielded into a world that's not their own, that identity becomes confused. Mm-hmm. And so you'll see things, unfortunately, where you'll hear about a young dark-skinned girl who wants to straighten her hair because it doesn't look, like her friends. You'll hear about a young person who tries to bleach themselves. And so I think this was really pointed out well from a pop culture standpoint in the documentary Dark Girls, when you would hear the stories of these young ladies who wanted everything in their power to just become lighter, because things were, even if you weren't white, it was equated that it was easier for you to at least be light-skinned or fair-skinned inside of this society. And so when we see the different things that people can go through as far as not loving themselves, not understanding themselves, the beauty and what they bring to the table, we see the main value for racial identity. And if you're inside of let's say I'm a young black child and I've been mercifully, placed in foster care through some type of transracial adoption, or with a family who doesn't look like me, or maybe even they look like me but their SES background is different. How do I still stay in root with who I am inside of myself? How do I learn about myself and learn to see that I love myself? Because even on an unconscious or subconscious level, a white family can tell a black kid that they're not good without even knowing it. Like I said, kind of ignorantly.
Is it implied?
It's an implied type of thing that we're better because we had to come get you out of here. They might not say it, but we saved you. Exactly. Yeah. It's the missionary white. They said, we got you out of here. We put you in a better school. We put you in a better neighborhood. But what does better say? Well, we took you out of a black neighborhood to a white neighborhood. And you got to understand, with the inch-high private eye, young people, they're great at observing, but they're not great in really, as far as when you want to say how they really break things and information down. So just because I observe it doesn't mean that I can break it down effectively the right way. So if I'm miscommunicated to myself in my mind thinking, hey, now that white does equate to better, then why would I want to be black?
And, and just to piggyback on what you just said, the North American Council on Adoptable Children talks about how fragile and delicate or controversial the topic of transracial adoption and foster care has been for years. And so part of the question I have is it good to have transracial adoptions and foster care, or should we be looking at what we need to do to keep children connected to their culture, to their race, to their communities, and possibly in a transracial environment? So if I have a family that's live in the same neighborhood for me, but yet they're from a different ethnicity or racial background, that it would be acceptable for me to live there in that community versus transporting me 4 hours away into a community that looks nothing like what I'm used to. Is there any disadvantages to placing children in transracial or in environments?
Right, I think you just answered the question,
Probably
but I think it's a yes and no question.
Okay.
Is it bad? Yes, it can be bad if we don't take those safeguards that you just talked about, as far as keeping a person with a connection to their community, with a connection to their to the relatives, to the other people who they love and will need to be connected to, especially when they're emancipated at the age of 18. You can't take a person out of an environment. It's like taking, and this is a bad analogy, but just one I can use. If you take an animal out of the wildlife and you put it in the zoo, and then you put it back in the wildlife, he's not prepared anymore. He doesn't understand how to deal. He's going to be, a
domesticated.
Victim. Yeah, and so when we start to think about even us, if you put me in a situation, let's break it down like this. I was to win a lottery, and this happens all the time, and then I go bankrupt, which happens to most lottery winners. And then I have to go back to the conditions I was in. It's one thing to be poor and always be poor, But it's another thing to be poor, but then to have the comforts of some of the amenities in life, to be introduced to some things, and then to have to go back to being poor again. And I don't even say that from a monetary standpoint, but I say that from a cultural and an understanding. It's sometimes hard to be uprooted, to have an understanding, to have a connection, to be taken away from that, and then to be placed back in that. You almost feel lost, and now you're almost like what happened to a lot of our children who are part of biracial families. They sometimes feel, where do I belong? Because sometimes I'm not black enough for my black family, I'm too black for my white family, and it becomes a difficult part for them to really understand. Not saying not all, but and that goes with the point. If the biracial family is good, we're letting them understand that there's love on each side, respect on each side. You can have a well-balanced biracial kid. But now specifically, if you have a biracial kid where one side of the family is really adamant that they don't want that child, that they don't accept them, that they are, the oddity in the family, that increases it. And I think that's the same parallel with the transracial adoption to a family that's not culturally competent.
Well, if people want to join this conversation, they can call 414-444-5250, 414-444-5250. But, I'm glad you bring up that biracial piece, too, because we see that happen every day, but particularly for children who are foster children, that's one issue, but then being biracial in a foster child, that's a whole nother beast right there as it relates to a healthy identity. Where do I fit in? You have to deal with the issue of, I'm a foster kid, where do I fit in? But also, too, now that I'm biracial, there's a lot of theories on social learning, object relations, and identification that are useful in explaining how children create or develop healthy racial, religious, ethnic, gender, class identities. And one of the things that you kind of talked about earlier was the object identification. The young lady who wants to press or straighten her hair so that she can look like folk who are around her or what she see on TV. There are a couple things I think that people have to do in order that contributes rather to a healthy sense of who I am, identity, and one of them is observing what group is in power. Who's in power, and then are there any members of my community who sit in powerful places or seats or in positions? For example, let's use President Barack Obama. It is so essentially important that African American young boys, know who he is and know what he does. And that right now he sits as the most powerful person on the face of this planet.
But see, that's a part of our culture too. Because when I look at Barack, I got nothing but respect and admiration for him. I consider him the first black president just because he is. But from a biological standpoint, he's biracial. And they never want to talk about his white side, because that's still the white dominance. That's the one drop, the hypo descent law. If you got one drop of black blood and you're black, you're contaminated, you're not good. So for a biracial person, what does that say to them when they see a biracial president, but he's only talked about as the black president? And so get me wrong, because that's how our community has been throughout the ages. It's always been upon us when we saw a biracial child that usually we took them in as just one of our own, as though there was nothing. And I mean, really, at the end of the day, it really is nothing. I think we make more of the colored thing than what it really is. But just the fact that we even had to hear that and say that, I think it shows a confusion on what racial identity is still in America in 2010, 2015.
Well, you know what? Let me ask you this, because I'm not sure if you remember years ago when we were growing up, in Jet magazine. I haven't seen it since. You know where I'm going to go, right?
No, I don't. It went to the Beauty of the Week with Jet magazine.
Oh no! I was going to get there, but I remember growing up, and I used to always see a book frequently advertised in Jet magazine. Since the election of President Obama, I have not seen that book advertised, but it was called The Sixth Black President, Black Blood, White Mask. Do you remember that? And Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln was listed there, but then, and in a sense, they would have been, if this is factual, biracial presidents.
And the documentary Hidden Colors, and Dr. Umar Johnson is going to be in town, one of the speakers in that documentary. They talked about that with great specificity as far as that. And that was one of the things that the candidates used against Abraham Lincoln, that he was of Negro descent.
Wow. So that's interesting. So when we go back, talking about this whole identity piece and understanding the importance of a healthy racial, ethnic, and cultural identity, we were talking about object identification and also understanding who's in power and the folk who are in power. Is there anybody in that group that looks like me? But the other thing was assuming that because he or she is like that person, that they have the ability, that they have, you know, what it takes to achieve that sense of greatness as well. And so that's why I think this whole piece around not just President Obama, but looking around our environment and making sure that if these children are placed in transracial adoptive homes,
that they see those positive
images. That's critically important. So it's important that if folk are going to say, I'm going to adopt a white child, I need to understand about white culture. If I'm going to adopt a Hispanic child, I need to study that particular Hispanic culture. You know, where's
not
that
just
child?
the superficial parts that we do in our society and whatnot, but really to go in detail. And the thing is, this is what I tell a parent of any culture that has a child from a different culture. Once that child is in your house, is in your family, then you become a part of that culture. That now becomes a part of your identity, because if that child is a part of you, everything that's important to them, everything that's a part of their history and their progressive development, positive development, has to now become a part of your DNA also. And if it does not, it will not be etched into them in that same way.
Let me read you something, and I want to get your feedback on this. The minority child identity affects his or her self-esteem, confidence, goals, worth, self-respect, sense of entitlement, and expectations by making him or her feel inferior. This inferiority is not the result of identifying with or being a member of a minority group, but from exposure to discrimination, prejudice, and negative stereotypes about said group. A child from a minority group that is celebrated, held in esteem, or that shares power and control with the dominant group can have identities that are just as positive as a child from that dominant group. Do you think that's true? Or
well, this is what I think, and when you were saying that, my mind just went to Stanley Tookie Williams, the notorious founder of the Crips, and he had said something that was awfully powerful to me, and I don't know it verbatim, but basically what he said when you look at they were talking about black on black crime. He said when a young black male sees another black male, what he sees is the image that's been portrayed, that this person is useless, that this person is valueless, that this person is nothing. And so it makes it easier to do different things to them. And he said, even though it's yourself, that's the insane genius of the social engineering that has happened, because we've been taught to self-hate. We've been taught to annihilate and to self-genocide ourselves in that manner. He said, so when you see yourself written, it's just like when you look at a terrorist and they say, well, I'm blowing this up for a great cause. It's that same thing when we see ourselves destroying the evil. We look at ourselves as a hero. The unfortunate thing is, when you see yourself as the enemy, you see the self-destructive behavior not only that you would do to yourself, but what you would do to people who look like you,
just like you.
And that's clearly your community. So on the wings of what you were speaking of, yes, when you see things that look good, you want to do good. It's just like if you go into somebody's house that's clean, you a little bit more careful on where you place the bottle, where you put your wrapping. You go into a junkie house, like, yeah,
anywhere
it's already
suitable.
junky, whatever, And young ladies, listen, it's just like it do. If a guy know a girl is a little pure, he gonna treat her a little differently. But if he knows she been around a couple times, he's like, hey, what I care is about how do you show yourself? How do you make other people respect you? And if the media doesn't respect you, and that's the image that you see, well, then you say, I'm nothing. I'm not gonna amount to nothing. It is what it is, and this is what they expect from me. Hey, you know what? I'd rather go to prison than college anyway, because it's gonna be more people that I know, more people that look like me. It's gonna be a better time. And you have that type of faulty thinking. But once you start to see those positive images and you say, hey, this is not who I am, this is a travesty, this is part of the post-traumatic slavery syndrome that Joy DeGroy talked about in Post-Traumatic Slavery Syndrome. Her book is a great read. Then we start to see, hey, you know what? This is part of that master plan of social engineering to make us destroy ourselves. When I start seeing those positive images and I believe that this really is me. I mean, think about when we first saw The Cosby Show. You know what, people, man, that ain't real. A black doctor and a lawyer, man, that ain't my neighbor. But why couldn't it be? Why was that so far-fetched that we had to say that this could only be on TV? Why couldn't it now become our goal? And you know what? That's what I want in life. And The Cosby Show, I think, was that for a lot of people to let us see things in a lot of different ways. But like you said, once you see those images, you reflect them and then you try to emulate them. But if you see negativity, well, you emulate what you see. You talked about search and learning. You can't help but to learn from what's around you. what's
Right,
valued,
right,
what's
right.
appreciated. And if I'm in a neighborhood and Iceberg Slim is what's being read, and if you don't know about that, well, then I got to read Iceberg Slim. And then when I read Iceberg Slim, I want to be Iceberg Slim and talk like him and act like him, and that puts in the wrong thing. And I'm not hating on Iceberg Slim, because I love his novels. I think he's a great person. I think he tried to flip his bad experiences into talking about something positive, but put it into prose in which people could understand it. At this time. But it just goes back to your point. What you see is what you're going to go after, but not only what you see, but what you see and respect. And what we have to do is now get a respect for those things that are positive, and unfortunately not the things that are negative. And it's like you see some of the things on TV that we highlight, that we love and that we see, and I don't care if it's Empire, if it's Scandal, if it's The Real Housewives or whatnot like that, the things that get heavy airplay on our on our television, then you juxtapose that to some of the other good things that could be on TV. It's
that's the thing.
what's
Media,
going to be watched.
Yeah, media in general.
But we gravitate.
Yeah.
No, I was just gonna say we gravitate to those things that's popular, that makes you fit in.
Right.
And if those things are negative, that's what we go after. So we have to make that scientists be cool. We have to make. I don't mind athletes and entertainers being looked at, because I think we need those in our society. But we just have to understand that we're more than that. And once we see people who look like us and are in those roles, but still are down with the community, still are still revolutionaries for the real cause, then I think we'll have people go there. Some of the thing is when people have escalated to elevated, I should say, to a certain social status from our race. Sometimes they forget where they came from, who they were, and people say, I don't want to be like that. I don't want to be looked at as a sellout or anything like that. So I think we need people from our community to be successful, but to come back and to help build the community. We talk about Harriet Tubman, and I just think she's the epitome of that. Here was this lady. She was born into slavery, got her freedom by herself. Ran around. Obviously was helped. But she was like, what, this ain't right. I'm going back. So she went back for her family.
Yeah.
Then she started going back for strangers. They said that over 17 years, she rescued 300 people. So that means after she got her slavery, she could have been considered a success. But she said, what, I'm going to risk my life, because if my people ain't free, I'm not free.
Right.
And until we have that type of mentality where somebody who, quote unquote, makes it and say, we want to have everybody to become a Moses, a Harriet Tubman, to come back. And I think that's what we do. You talk about being 68% African Americans involved in the rural welfare here in Milwaukee. What do we make up? About 37% of the population African Americans, just in general.
You mean in Milwaukee?
Yeah.
What do we make about? No, in Wisconsin.
No, in Wisconsin we're about 5.7%. But I mean in Milwaukee.
Oh, in Milwaukee County.
Yeah.
Is it like 30%?
I thought we were about 37, somewhere in that nature. But I'm saying that means that's double too. So it's a disproportionate number. Yeah. But what if everybody said, what? I'm going to take a kid that,
but I think it's so important for, and let's talk about this, because today in history, back in 1688, I believe it was the Quakers. They had a reformation, as you said. They reformed. They had an awakening, aha moment that the transatlantic slave trade and slavery was not a Christian thing. It was not a humane thing. And so they passed the first public resolution that slavery needs to be abolished. And so when we start talking about these relationships with other folk outside of our community, conductors and abolitionists on a part of the slave trade, black folk could have never been free independent of the support and help from some folk outside of their community, their culture. And that takes trust. And so likewise, kids who are in the foster care system today, as a service provider, I have to see myself as a conductor, but I also understand that there are some folk who are Caucasian and Hispanic who also work in child welfare, and they are the abolitionists, if you will, and that we have to really advocate to improve the child welfare system, because, and we're going to talk about this, I'm not sure exactly what happened with Dr. Daisy Nelson Century, but we can continue the conversation from this standpoint, this is a terrible situation that these children are in most cases. Foster care may have saved some people's lives, but in general, it's not the best place to raise kids. And when you add transracial, the race issue, we don't like to talk about racism and child welfare, but we're all aware that racism does exist. Both nationally, locally, it's there.
It's still individual and institutionalized.
It's institutionalized. So until we actually can address that and deal with it, and particularly from a transracial placement standpoint, and what I want to get to is because I've heard actually in a public meeting in this city where an individual said, that they didn't think that race matters. Why are we putting so much focus on it? It was talking about, she had adopted some black children, and race doesn't matter, color doesn't matter, and she had got teary-eyed and she got upset, and
you know what? Probably to her credit, because for her it didn't. Sometimes you have exceptional people, and I don't want to say it doesn't matter, because it does matter. But in her eyes, and maybe what she did, she was saying, I gave them everything I could. But the fallacy with her statement is thinking that everybody would go in like she did. And I'm giving her a big assumption that she did do everything to make it culturally competent for those children. But usually, if you get emotional like that, you say it's usually for a reason. Because she said, don't accuse me of something where I've been the example of this. And so maybe what we need to do is to highlight individuals who have done it properly and say, listen, I can show you how this can work. We know what doesn't work, but if we can find something that works, why reinvent the wheel? Let's get it, let's validate it, and once it's validated, let's replicate it, give it to all of the homes. Say, listen, if you're thinking about adopting someone outside of your race, these are some of the dudes that have been proven to be successful. We always have those top 10 lists. This is best practices. This is something that you should want to do. But for somebody to say that race doesn't matter shows a bit of naiveness and a bit of ignorance. But in her part, she probably saying, hey, you know what, I gave them all I had. And I always say this to that thing. I think love is something that transcends all of these false demographics that we put in. And if you give true love, then you have a healthy child. But in that true love, you find the things that's important to them and the things that's going to help them not only for the time period with you, but also when they leave the nest from where you're at, because they're going to have to go back into a different society, not protected by the cocoon that you might have shielded them from.
And so that can be a positive versus and a negative in a sense. Race matters, and I also think about for children who are in transracial placement when there's biological children who let's use the example of black child is removed, placed into a white family, and you have a white son, white daughter there. I think a lot of effort has to be demonstrated by that caregiver to make both children feel equal, because I think to some degree some folk from some communities can feel an automatic sense of superiority just based on the way society is ran. And so children, if it's not demonstrated in the home, coming from the parents, going to different school settings and other social environments, can come back and adopt that sense of I'm better than. So parents have to really keep that in check to make sure to understand that all humans, that we have value, that we are equal. One is not greater than the other. So I think that's another challenge or a goal that folk must take on if they're looking at adopting or accepting placement of a child that's outside of their culture.
And when you think about that, I try to think of like real life movies that's been biographies on people.
Okay.
And so when I think of adoption, I think of foster care. The first movie I think about is Antoine Fisher. Now, Antoine Fisher was adopted into a black home, a seemingly religious home. The father was a pastor, but yet he received physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse for years. So sometimes when the lady said color, race doesn't matter, sometimes we can have our own who does different things that's not beneficial. So what we want to do is first make sure that we have safe and loving homes, regardless of color. But then if there's somebody where there's a mismatch with the race, then what we want to do is make sure that they're being culturally competent. The second movie is The Blind Side, and that's where you had the football player who was older and was adopted by a white family. And from the way the story ends, I'm not as familiar with, I don't know them personally, so obviously you go off the movie and what was portrayed in that standpoint. But it was a fact where it was a lot of things that they couldn't understand about this young man,
right.
But also a lot of ways in which he had to assimilate into their culture. It was a very, very white world. He even ended up going to their school, Ole Miss, where the flag, the mascot for the one of the symbols is the old Confederated rebel flag and whatnot like that. And he was there, so it's a sense of confusion. I think sometimes that comes, but like I said, that's from a naiveness and the ignorance. Like I said, I don't know that family, but they try to portray it like it can work. And some of those things, as far as what it basically goes down to, again, I think as far as saying what's important to the child, reaching out to different people who may know more than you. And I think that's the hard part with all of us as adults, to think that we have all the answers and maybe too proud to ask for help. And I think if you're going to be in that situation, to have an abundance of people, I don't think one black person can speak for all black people.
Right.
So
right.
If you have a situation like that, what I think you want to do is to put that child in a myriad of situations. And I think about just my wife. She grew up in a white community, but one of the things her parents did to shield her and to make sure that she had a proper racial identity was they went to all black church, they was in all black clubs and things of that nature, and then also what happened at home. So they knew what was going to happen at schools, and this was in Wisconsin, in Mequon. And it's not just but hop, skipping, and jumping away from Milwaukee, but still worlds and worlds apart. They had to make sure though that their daughters was properly trained in understanding to have a love of self, a love of community, a love of others, while having a healthy respect for all people, but definitely having that secure love and self. So you could not be intimidated, that you could not be made to feel inferior by anybody who was around you, even though it was mostly around you and surrounded you.
Those are very valid points. One thing you had talked about that provides help build a healthy self-identity, racial identity, culture identity, is to advocate. In school environments. If you have a child that's from a different culture, race, and let's just say African American child, Black History Month, African American child is placed in a white community, and you notice in that school district they're not doing a lot around Black history programs. The songs that they're teaching in the school in the music class does not reflect or connect to Black culture. The hymns and whatever. That you can be a major voice and advocate in those environments to help introduce some of those elements.
And I think that's a big thing, because when you say advocate, because sometimes somebody can adopt a person, but you say, you know what, I can still help with the transition for other families who are doing it. So how can I educate myself and equip myself so I can bring that too? So maybe you're a teacher in an environment where you understand that. So before the family has to do it, you can help educate them. You can put them in different settings and scenarios that's comfortable.
And first, let me just give a very warm thank you to a number of Caucasian families and social workers and Latino workers and Latino families who take African American children and are working to promote their healthy self-development, cultural development, and ethnic development. They are our modern day John Wesleys, John Newtons, and John Browns, and Father Grappies, and the Reverend James Reed of the Civil Rights Movement, and Viola Luezzo, I believe her name is Luezzo. But those individuals who really advocate for our children when they're removed from their communities, or even when they're within their community but they're placed in homes that don't look like them. So I really do appreciate all the social worker, case managers, and people who really work to help African American children. But you know what? We were looking at this conversation today, and I was drawing some connection or similarities between foster care and slavery. And I was really surprised when I started generating a list, because we know that slavery, like foster care, is an adverse childhood experience.
Oh my goodness, yes.
And that's when we start talking about trauma, But when you look at parental and sibling separation, that's one thing, fathers being removed from their homes. Abuse of a parent. Domestic violence in the sense of that community, community violence.
Mental illness within the community.
Mental illness, and we don't talk about that a lot, but it had to be a lot of mental illness.
If I can just add,
sure.
One of the mental illnesses I know that it was something called drapetomania during the days of slavery. And drapetomania basically is what white people call any slave who wanted to run away. They said they suffer from drapetomania. How could you want to run away from this civilized area that we've given you? We've given you education and learning and food and shelter. So any slave that wanted to run away was diagnosed with something called drapetomania.
And so what were the master's diagnosis? Insanity.
They thought they were revolutionaries, missionaries, all a part of the manifest destiny. They're coming over, bringing education and intellect to the savages.
But you know what? There's also educational challenges that we see with foster care youth as well as with slaves. But then multiple placement disruptions. moved around. I mean, there's so many similarities.
You speak about that, and right now on BET, they're doing a mini series called The Book of Negroes. I suggest that everyone who get a chance to watch it. It's concluding tonight, but BET is going to show all of the other shows. They're probably showing about right now those first episodes. It's 6 episodes. But basically what it is, I think it's roots for this generation. It's about a young girl whose parents are killed in front of her by the slave traders in Africa. She's brought over to America where she's made a slave, but she finds her freedom, is put back into slavery, and then there's a big thing, should they fight for, because this is during the American Revolution time, should they fight for the British, should they fight for the Patriots, who's going to win, who's going to prevail, and whatnot. But when you look at this young girl's life, she was extremely resilient, very intelligent, and just the gist of it is, I looked through the ACE studies with her, and she would have had all 10. The girl was raped, she was beaten, she was physically abused, sexually abused, seen her parents not only abused but killed before her, not only taken and placed from different families, she was taken across the ocean. So when we talk about displacement, it was a lot of different things. So when you look at that compared to a lot of our foster children now, they go through some of the same traumatic experiences. It's eerie, the similarities.
It's very eerie. I mean, and when you think about being homesick, loss of community and culture, what about there's a monetary value attached to the child?
60 pounds. 60 pounds. No, that's what they were selling.
Underground communication system. There's always a gatekeeper, somebody in the family who knew what was going on and how to access. But also, Harriet Tubman drugged children with paregoric to keep them quiet while slave patrols rolled by. And we're not going to talk about all the drugs that we have to manage children's behavior while they're in the system. So, again, tune in next week to Fresh Start Today at 3 p.m. on next Wednesday. Have a safe, blessed week, and enjoy your life.
Fresh Start.
All right.